So what I'm going to talk about is the type of research that I do into typography. And typography, for me, is broader than typefaces. It's probably the same for many others of you. So I'm talking about layout as well as typefaces. So what I will cover, in particular, is the approach that I use, and talk about the methods. I'll talk about my objectives, the specific things that I'm aiming to find out with this research, and I'll illustrate this with some results. So there'll be examples of the work that I've done, and I'll give examples from two areas of research. One of them I'm calling ease of reading from screen. It's actually, I suppose, legibility research and conducted on screen. And the second area of research, which is quite different, although I'll show you that there are similarities, is looking at typographers' judgments. So that might be of interest to you if you're a type educator or a type designer. So, my approach. As was said in the introduction, my background is psychology, and in particular experimental psychology, meaning that the sort of training I have involves running experiments, getting people to sit down and do particular tasks and to measure how they do them. So at once I might have put off many of you because it's an artificial testing situation, but it's what I do. So tough, really. Now that psychology enables me to, I suppose, devise tests of particular things, and as you can see, I look at reading from screen, but I'm really not quite sure the particular direction I'm taking. So I have varied quite a lot of the things I do, even though they have some underlying links to them. So I'm still not sure where I'm going. So what is perception? I was so pleased to hear yesterday in one of the introductions that what is important is what we see, what we behold. And that's exactly what I think. So what I'm illustrating here is that designers, you may design objects, you may draw pictures, you design texts, you vary typography, but what's actually important, I think, is the percept, how people perceive that. And the picture here shows that each of the things that we look at forms a retinal image. The retinal image is just an area on the back of our eye where there will be a picture, an image of the thing that we see. So if we come back to the right way around, what I want to suggest, as most people do that work in perception, is that there might not be an exact one-to-one relationship between the retinal image, or the object, or the picture, or the typography, and what we perceive. So there's actually a dotted line there, although it might not be very visible. Because there's this difference, it is important that we examine the way we perceive things rather than we examine what you design. So it's important how people interpret what you design. And this is a typical example of an ambiguous figure. So this demonstrates that there isn't a one-to-one relationship between the physical and the retinal image and our perception. So hopefully you're all able to see two images in this, one of an old woman and one of a young woman. You can't see them both at once, but you should be able to flip between the two. There's not much response here, but I assume you can see them. You're going to have to respond later because I'm going to stand here and wait until you do, because I won't be able to continue. But right, you can all see the ambiguous figure, I'm sure. So this illustrates the fact that we add something or we interpret and we bring things to our perceptions. It usually helps when you're told what it is that you can see as well. Okay, so many, many years ago, although I wasn't quite that young, I started work on legibility on screen. And I did this for a few reasons. One of them was that the research at that time, which would be was last century, it would be 1990s, I guess, that research was generally looking at the difference between reading print and reading from screen. And I wanted to optimize reading from screen and therefore didn't want to do the comparison, but wanted to purely look at the effects of different layouts on reading from screen. The other reason was that I got some money from Microsoft to fund this research. I'll just add that as an afterthought. One of the difficulties at that time, and perhaps still, is that there are many guidelines which tell us how to design for print and how to design for screen. Some of those are based on research and evidence. Some of those are what people think. Now, I'm not discrediting craft knowledge and designer's knowledge, but sometimes we need to explore new avenues, and especially if we're designing for a different medium, to make sure that what we're saying as a guideline is actually backed up and is correct. So this book by Karen Shriver, and I admire Karen's work, and I think it's a very good book. Within it includes a short paragraph on reading from screen, as this is a fairly old book. And if I just highlight the part that I want you to focus upon in particular, what this says is that on a computer screen, a shorter line length is more desirable, about 40 to 60 characters. And she's contrasting that with reading print, where a longer line length might be okay. Now, there was at that time quite a lot of research on reading print, which would support and provide evidence for the longer line length. But I'm unaware of anything that actually suggested that it would be more desirable to have a shorter line length on screen. However, I was also, at that time, giving workshops on reading from screen and saying it's better to have a shorter line length. So there's something intuitively correct about that. But I wanted to find out whether it was true. So the method that I've used, and this really is the same as much traditional legibility research, so there's nothing particularly novel here, is to time how long it takes someone to read a text, to check that they have read it, in other words, they can answer some questions or they know what it says, because clearly we can say we've read something and have no understanding or no memory for what we've read. So it's important to make sure that there is some comprehension, some understanding. And also, what's a fairly typical measure is to ask for people's judgments of how easy they find something to read. And that can be particularly valuable together with finding out how people perform, how fast they read, or how much they understand. So just before I show my slightly odd technique of checking on reading, I'll show you a couple of other examples. This one has been used, this particular paper I'm citing is from 2002, and this is a check that people are reading. If you ask people to point out the word or words which spoil the meaning of the text. So I've helped you here by highlighting the words. They would not be highlighted in the study, otherwise it would be far too easy. But the word potion should actually be notion, so one letter's been changed, and the word fate should be mate, so it should be mate selection. So when someone is reading through this, they have to be able to identify the words that spoil the meaning. This is similar in principle to an older, more established test of speed of reading by Tinker, who's a well-known legibility researcher. And you can read this one, I think, and spot the word that spoils or doesn't make sense. So what spoils the meaning or doesn't make sense in this sentence? So wonderful, thank you. It's nice to have some responses. So this would be another test of making sure that it's being read. What I did was something rather different and something that the participants in the study felt was a little odd, because I asked them to say, could you answer this question based on what you've read? And generally people want to answer the question. They don't want to say, yes, I can answer the question. They want to give you the answer. But the reason not to ask people for the answer is that it's difficult to assess whether or not they've given the correct answer. It might be almost correct, it might be lacking some detail. So in this way, you get a very clear-cut answer of whether someone could say whether it was answerable or not. So if we look at the top question, I'll just show you how it works in practice. What happened to Daisy's parents? These questions would come after someone had read the text. And this is the text, which you don't need to read, but there's a part highlighted. And if I blow that up, zoom in, then we find that Daisy's parents are sadly dead. Her mother died when she was young. Her father ran off with another woman and died on the way to America. A terrible story. But what we learn from this is that we can answer the question, what happened to Daisy's parents? So if the participants in my study have read the text thoroughly, they would be able to say they could answer that question. So as I said, a slightly bizarre way of testing that people have read something properly, but a very easy way to assess the results. What's difficult is coming up with questions that cannot be answered by the text. Because if you think about that, you have to write a question that is plausible to be within that text, but doesn't actually have that information in there. So I put the time into preparing my material and making sure that it's easy to mark afterwards, to assess afterwards. So what did I test? I tested different line lengths because I was picking up on this 40 to 60 characters per line. And I tested 6 different line lengths. This is the shortest line length I tested, and it's only on average 25 characters per line. So I guess a thin newspaper type column of text. I'll just show you 3 examples. So this is the narrowest. This is the medium length, which is 55 characters. And this one is the longest one I tested, which is 100 characters per line. So clearly a very long line length. What did I find? I found what was unexpected, that it actually takes less time to read a long line length. And if I just talk you through this graph, what is being on the y-axis, the mean time in seconds, the higher the value, the longer it takes to read something. And along the bottom, we've got the 6 different line lengths. So as you move from left to right, the lines get longer. You'll see bars on each of the data points, and this indicates the variation among the different participants. But there's a general trend to get quicker as the line is longer. There were 2 different conditions also in this study. One of them, the participants could scroll through the text, so go line by line, and the other one, they read a screen full of text, pressed a key and got the next screen full of text, and that's what's called paged. And this is the type of research that was being done last century, so we are looking at much older technology, clearly. So this was unexpected, and my colleagues in the Department of Typography at Reading didn't believe the results because these aren't the same as reading print, and it is said that it is difficult to read a long line length because when you get to the end of the line, your eye makes a return sweep, and if that is a long sweep, it'll go to the wrong place. I wasn't too sure I believed them either. I did carry on researching in this area, and other people have as well, so we'll come to that in a moment. I did ask as well, as I mentioned, I asked people to say what they thought was easiest to read. Can you have a guess as to what people thought was easiest to read? Short, long, middle? Middle? Indeed, yes. So the medium line length of about 55 characters per line was thought to be easiest to read. These weren't typographers, because had they been typographers, you would have said that one anyway, so, because you're conditioned to believe that this is the easiest to read. What about the hardest to read? Long. We've got a longest here. Does anyone think the shortest? Yeah. It was actually the longest, but the next one would have been the shortest, so you're all correct. So there's a difference here between what people think is easiest to read and perhaps what they prefer, and what in effect is easier to read. So there's a problem there. I just returned to the guidelines at this point because I've criticised guidelines for perhaps not being based on evidence or saying things that might not be backed up by evidence. But there are guidelines that are based on evidence, and I show you this one because the evidence includes my own research. So there is a section within this on choosing appropriate line lengths, and if we zoom in, it talks about the difference between performance and preference, so suggesting that if performance is important, then you should have a long line length. If preference is important, then a shorter line length. I think there is a problem with this, that people might be immediately put off by a long line length, so never actually get to perform. But at this point, I thought maybe people are reading fast when it's a long line because it's so horrible, they want to get through it quickly. So actually it would be important to find out what is happening when people are reading faster. What do people lose when they read faster? Presumably you can't remember as much or you can't take in as much. So what I did was to train people to speed up their reading. And just to say at this point, this is not speed reading in the sense that you go on a course, pay some money, and supposedly read faster and just as accurately afterwards. I hope there aren't any people in the room that sell those courses, but they are absolute rubbish. There's no evidence that they help. I did go on one myself at the University of Reading because they had one, presumably for students to help speed up their reading. What they didn't know is that I was there with my research assistant to work out what they were saying and why they were saying it. So there is a good critique of speed reading in a book on the psychology of reading. So I wasn't trying to do that, but I was trying to get people to read faster than their normal speed of reading, and then to look at what people remember when they read faster. So each participant read a passage of text, and we measure on the computer how long it takes them to read that, and then we try and get them to read. Well, first of all, we wanted it to be twice as fast, but that's incredibly difficult, so it wasn't that. So they'll get some feedback and asked to read another passage of text, and if they speed up, then they're encouraged to either read a bit faster or to continue with the experiment. So that's how we trained people to read fast, just by saying, read faster, please. Again, there were different line lengths, this time just 3 line lengths, the very short, the medium length as you see here, and the long line length. And just note that we, at this point, introduced a grey background alongside the text because we thought the glare of the screen might have been a problem with the short line length. So what happens when you read quickly? Well, not surprisingly, you recall or understand less. That wasn't what we were trying to find. We would have expected that. What we were hoping to find is that the different line lengths might affect our reading, and that is the case. So what we've got here are the top dots are the normal reading, and the lower ones, the lower 3, are the fast reading. And we're looking at how much people understand. So the higher the value, the more that's understood. And the medium line length of 55 characters per line, people recalled more from that line length than either the short one or the long one. So there is some indication that line length is influencing comprehension. But what we wanted to know was, what do we lose if we read quickly? So there might be some things we remember, other things we forget. So we spent a long time writing multiple choice questions which ask things about the title, main ideas, the structure, and I'll just focus on 3 of those. So the main idea, so that would be something that was fairly central to the story, to the text that was being read. The structure looked at the order in which things were presented, and the incidental asked for some detail. We also looked at precise memory for individual sentences. So what don't people remember? So here we'll look at the lowest point on the graph, and that's got S underneath it. So what people don't remember is the structure of what they've read. That means the order in which things appeared. So I think that is interesting because it does suggest that when reading on screen, we are losing some of the cues to the location of information. That's assuming we're not reading a PDF which has normal pagination, because then we would have the cues that we have in a book. We sometimes remember that something we've previously read was on the top left of a page, and we'll look for it in that way. You can't do that if you're scrolling through a long text. So this research has actually been replicated. Other people have found that longer line lengths can be read faster than shorter line lengths, and I believe this same result dealing with the structure. But now I come to more recent research, so I've grown up a bit now. I am older than in the photo, but it is some years later. And now I'm going to look at how typographers perceive type. So this is very, very different to what I've just spoken about, but it still involves perception. What I worked on for quite a few years was something called categorical perception, which is a phenomenon that's known to psychologists, not all psychologists, but some psychologists. And what it describes is the fact that for some types of visual material and auditory material as well, we put things into categories even though they don't naturally form categories. So I hope, as I show you some other examples, it'll become a little clearer. Colour is the best example of this. We perceive colours categorically. In other words, we say that something is red or orange, but the physical continuum for light is continuous. So that there aren't these discrete categories of colour. There's continuous variation in the wavelength, and we interpret that, perceive that as categories of colours. Now there might be a linguistic or labelling aspect to this as well, but I'm not going to go into that at all. You don't need to be a designer to perceive colour categorically either. It is a general, fairly general phenomenon. Another thing that is perceived categorically is musical intervals. Now I have to say my PhD was on music, which is why I know about this. And there's a difference here because musical intervals are only perceived categorically if you are a musician. And any of you that's had musical training and oral training will perhaps know that you are taught to recognize and identify musical intervals, and it's extremely tedious, but what that does is to provide you with categories for identifying these intervals. What's more interesting for typefaces is that faces are perceived categorically. Now, it's not just because a typeface might be like a face, it's clearly not, but faces don't have a natural continuum. We don't have one person's face gradually becoming another person's face. So in order to experiment, these researchers created a continuum from one Belgian psychologist to another Belgian psychologist. So you've got one real person on the left and another real person on the right, but the ones in between are the morphing, the interpolation. So the natural question is, if faces which don't have a natural continuum but are multi-dimensional like typefaces vary in terms of contrast, stress, X height and so on. So they might be like faces, which vary in many ways as well. Might typefaces be perceived categorically, and might that be by typographers? Because maybe there's an element of training in this, in the same way that musicians are trained. So what we did was to create a continuum of typefaces from Times to Helvetica, and this is where I thank the students who were in the department at the time who did this for me. So one continuum was Timevetica, and another continuum was Garadoni, from Garamond to Bodoni. So hopefully you see that there's a gradual change from one typeface to the other typeface as you go from the top to the bottom. So this needs you who are typeface designers, it needs your expertise to do this. I could not do this myself. So now on to my last example of how typographers perceive type. And if you thought at this point that I'm a little bit eccentric, then that will be confirmed by this next experiment. What you should have seen, or rather not seen, is that when the images are upside down, it is much more difficult to locate, to notice the distortion. So this tells us that when we perceive faces, and I'm back to faces again, we perceive them in a different way in the upright orientation to the other orientation. Now, that might be fairly obvious, but also the theory tells us that we perceive them in a rather special way, and it's called configural processing. And that means that what we're looking at are the relationships between the space between the eyes, the nose, and the mouth. So all faces will have, most faces will have two eyes, above a nose, above a mouth. But what can differentiate them, other than the colour of eyes, etc., are the spatial relationships. So how close together your eyes are, etc. And when faces are upside down, that relationship is destroyed, or it's rather more difficult to use. So I wondered whether typographers might perceive typefaces in a different way upside down to non-typographers. And why would I think that? Well, you perhaps had the rehearsal for that. But also because there's been a study on dogs and dog breeders. I like to bring in research from all sorts of other areas that appears have nothing to do with typography, but I believe they do. Now this study looked at whether dog breeders could identify or distinguish between their dogs when their dogs are upside down as compared to the right way up. Just in case you're worried, I think they did it with photographs and not with the dogs. Now, I found pictures of the correct breeds, but they're not the same coloured dogs, so I think anyone would be able to tell the difference between a white dog and a black dog, so can you assume that they were all the same colour when the experiment was done? Now, what these researchers found is if you weren't a dog breeder, and if you didn't breed that particular type of dog, you couldn't do it. You weren't disturbed by the dog being upside down, whereas if you were an expert, you were disturbed by the dog being upside down. So I'll come back to why that might seem a little odd, but let's look at type. So again, I need your help on this. You're going to see two paragraphs of text, one after the other, and you've got to say, are they in the same typeface or are they in a different typeface? I'm afraid there is a correct answer to this. It's just that I can't remember what they are, so I hope you get them right. Okay, so is this the same typeface as this? 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 Anyone think it is? Anyone think it isn't? You want to put them again? So that one's the first one, I hope. Let me check that, yes. That one's the first one. That one's the second one. Good, getting there. Yeah, I think they are as well. It is obviously difficult to do them one after the other, but it has to be difficult because if you get them all right, this study won't show anything. So one more time. Is this the same as this? We've had a yes and we've had it. I'll just do it again. This and this. Yes. I'm not certain of the answer, but I think they are different. But if you felt they were the same, that's good because it probably means you're a designer in a rather strange sort of way. It doesn't mean you're not either if you got it wrong. So here are the results. Let me explain what they are and then what they mean. So in this study, I did manage to include a group of designers, typographers, and also a group of non-designers because my primary aim was to see whether designers are looking at type in a different way. And on the left-hand side is a measure of how well people were able to discriminate. So the higher the value, the better people are able to discriminate. Now you do see that the typographers, the designers, are better overall. They actually were a lot better than this because I was able to adjust the difficulty of the task. So if you were a typographer, the difference between the typefaces would have been much less than if you were a non-typographer, a non-designer. But what is interesting, I think, is that the designers did show an effect of whether the typeface was the right way up, whether it was upright, or whether it was inverted. So for typographers, if you turn the typeface upside down, it matters, whereas if you're a non-designer, it doesn't matter if you turn the typeface upside down. They're still able to do it, but they're doing it in a different way. And I think what typographers are doing are using the configural properties of type, the relationships between things like the location of the serifs, the contrast. Those things are being used when a typeface is the right way up. When you turn it upside down in the way that I did, you destroy those relationships, so you can't then use them, and it becomes more difficult. Because non-designers don't use that relationship, it doesn't matter whether it's the right way up or not. So I was very pleased with that result. So what have I learned from my research? Firstly, I think to refer to the early research, the screen legibility research, one of the criticisms, the critiques of legibility research is that it just confirms what typographers already know. I would say that not all legibility research confirms what we already know, and there can be some surprises. So although I might not do a lot of legibility research now, I do think there are things that still need to be researched. I indicated the methods that I used, which involved a lot of time preparing the materials, preparing the questions, making sure that the questions did actually work. And I think that's important to prepare your materials for studies. Otherwise, there's no point in doing the study at all. What I found particularly exciting is drawing upon other areas of research. So I've done, as you can see, I've looked at quite a lot of face perception research, which has been quite informative in terms of directing me for particular things to look at. Even though they might be quite strange, it appears that typefaces might have some similar properties to faces. And it's exciting. And perhaps what you all wanted to know is now confirmed. It's true that typographers are different. You do not see the world in the same way. You do not see type in the same way. And because you don't, that is potentially a problem for you being the judge of readers and how readers will respond. But I leave that on your conscience as to whether you take that home as a message and use it. Thank you.